For decades, the European Union was known primarily as an economic superpower, a massive trading bloc that prioritized diplomacy and business over bombs and battalions. But almost overnight, that reality has shattered. In response to growing global instability, the European Union is now drafting shocking official plans to centralize its military capabilities and prepare for continental war. We are watching the unprecedented rise of a unified European defense strategy that completely bypasses NATO. But why should Christians care about EU military funding? Because in Revelation chapter 17, the Bible warns of 10 kings who will one day hand their combined military power over to a single dictator. In this briefing, we will look at the breaking headlines out of Brussels, cut through the political noise, and explain exactly why a rapidly militarized Europe is a massive prophetic alarm bell. The geopolitical landscape of Europe is changing faster than at any time since the end of the Cold War. For decades, the foundational promise of the European Union was peace through economic interdependence. The idea was simple: if nations trade together, they will not fight each other. Consequently, military readiness took a back seat to economic growth. Individual nations relied on the American security umbrella through NATO, allowing their own armies to shrink and their defense budgets to plummet. That era of European pacifism is officially dead. Triggered by the brutal realities of war returning to the eastern borders of the continent, the leadership in Brussels has realized that economic soft power is useless against tanks and artillery. As a result, the European Union is now executing a massive, coordinated pivot toward hard military power. Recent reports and strategic proposals from the highest levels of the EU leadership outline shocking plans for a true defense union. This is not just about individual countries spending more on their own armies. Brussels is actively pushing for centralized military funding, joint weapons procurement, and a heavily integrated defense strategy that operates independently of NATO. They are proposing a multi-billion euro defense fund to rapidly expand the European military-industrial complex. We are seeing the framework for the EU rapid deployment capacity being finalized, a highly mobile, heavily armed European force capable of striking quickly anywhere in the world, commanded directly from the European Union rather than individual national capitals. For the secular geopolitical analyst, this is simply a pragmatic, necessary evolution. Europe feels threatened, and therefore, Europe must arm itself. The political leadership in France, Germany, and Brussels argues that Europe can no longer rely entirely on the United States for its survival. They argue that a unified European military is the only way to guarantee the sovereignty of the continent in a dangerous 21st century. What we are witnessing is the rapid militarization of a massive economic bloc. The European Union is attempting to transform itself from a bureaucratic trading partner into a sovereign military superpower. But for those who view these geopolitical tectonic shifts through the lens of biblical prophecy, this sudden and aggressive push for European military integration is not just a strategic necessity. It is the fulfillment of a structural prerequisite for the end times. The geopolitical scaffolding required for the final empire is being rapidly assembled right before our eyes. When secular analysts look at the European Union's pivot toward rapid militarization, they see a necessary geopolitical defense strategy. But when Christians look at this exact same shift, we see the structural foundation of the Antichrist's final empire being laid. We are watching this closely because biblical prophecy is absolutely clear that the final global dictator will not rise to power through peace and diplomacy alone. He requires an overwhelming, unprecedented military machine to enforce his will upon the earth. For decades, many students of prophecy struggled to understand how Europe could possibly fulfill its biblical destiny as the revived Roman Empire. A massive bureaucratic trading bloc that relied on the United States for its defense simply did not match the terrifying, iron-toothed beast described in the book of Daniel. But a federalized European superstate, armed to the teeth, centrally commanded, and operating independently of NATO, perfectly matches the biblical description of the final world empire. Furthermore, Christians are watching this because of what a unified European military means for the nation of Israel. Historically, the United States has been Israel's primary military backer and diplomatic shield. But as global alliances shift and Europe attempts to establish itself as an independent, sovereign military superpower, the balance of power in the Middle East will inevitably change. A heavily armed, unified Europe will eventually demand a seat at the table in the Middle East, seeking to enforce its own vision of peace and security. This sets the perfect stage for a powerful European leader to step forward and confirm a covenant with many, backed not just by economic sanctions, but by a massive, centralized military force. To understand the profound prophetic significance of a militarized Europe, we must turn to the Book of Revelation, specifically chapter 17. In this passage, the Apostle John is given a terrifying vision of the final beast system that will dominate the earth in the last days. But John does not just see a single dictator. He sees a coalition of leaders who form the backbone of this empire. Revelation chapter 17 verses 12 and 13 explicitly state, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast." This passage is one of the most critical keys to understanding end times geopolitics. Notice carefully what these 10 leaders actually do. They do not fight against the Antichrist, nor are they conquered by him in a massive military campaign. Instead, they willingly give their power and strength unto him. In the original text, the concept of strength refers to absolute delegated authority, including military might and physical jurisdiction. For 10 kings to simultaneously hand over their combined military and political power to one man, the legal and structural framework for that transfer of sovereignty must already exist. You cannot hand over a unified continental army unless a unified continental army has already been built. The Antichrist does not have to spend decades building his own military machine from scratch. He simply hijacks a centralized, highly integrated military system that the nations of Europe willingly surrender to him. When we read headlines about the European Union attempting to centralize its defense forces and eliminate national vetoes over military action, we are watching the legal and military scaffolding of Revelation 17 being constructed in real time. To maintain clear biblical discernment, we must rigidly separate eschatological theory from observable political reality. So, what are the hard, undeniable facts regarding the rapid militarization of the European Union? First, it is a documented fact that the European Union is currently establishing a unified military command structure that operates entirely outside of NATO. The creation of the EU Rapid Deployment Capacity, a highly trained, heavily armed force of at least 5,000 troops capable of quick intervention, is no longer a theoretical political debate. It is an active military project scheduled to become fully operational in the near future. This force answers directly to Brussels, not to Washington, not to individual member states, and not to the United Nations. Secondly, it is a fact that the European Union is utilizing unprecedented financial instruments to aggressively fund weapons manufacturing. Through mechanisms like the European Peace Facility and new defense industrial strategies, billions of euros are being funneled directly into the defense sector to rapidly scale up ammunition, drone technology, and advanced weaponry production across the continent. For the first time in its entire history, the European Union is acting as a centralized purchaser of massive amounts of military hardware, effectively bypassing individual national procurement programs and creating a highly unified military-industrial complex. Third, it is a geopolitical fact that top European leaders, including the President of the European Commission and leading national figures in France and Germany, are openly demanding an end to the national veto regarding foreign and defense policy. Currently, a single member state can block a joint military decision. Brussels is actively pushing to abolish this rule in favor of qualified majority voting. If successful, this means the European Union could deploy troops, declare international sanctions, or initiate coordinated military action even if individual sovereign nations strongly disagree. These are not internet conspiracy theories or exaggerated speculation. These are the stated, documented policy objectives of the European Parliament and its executive leadership. The continent is legally, structurally, and financially reorganizing itself to function as a single, highly centralized sovereign military power, fundamentally altering the global balance of power. While the rapid funding and centralization of the European military are undeniable facts, how we view these events through the lens of biblical prophecy requires careful interpretation. As Christians, we must observe these geopolitical shifts without making dogmatic, absolute claims that the Bible itself does not explicitly state. When we see European leaders demanding the abolition of the national veto and proposing a centralized defense force, many prophecy scholars interpret this as the precise political mechanism that will eventually fulfill Revelation chapter 17. The Apostle John saw 10 kings who will give their power and strength unto the beast. For that exact scenario to occur, the legal framework must allow for national sovereignty to be seamlessly handed over to a central, dictatorial authority. The current push by Brussels to remove individual national control over the military could very well be the construction of that exact prophetic framework. Furthermore, this massive militarization raises a profound question about the identity of the final beast system. The Bible warns in Revelation chapter 13 that the whole world will marvel at the beast, asking, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" This implies that the Antichrist will control a military force so overwhelmingly advanced and powerful that the rest of the world will simply surrender in fear. A pacifist, bureaucratic European Union could never elicit that kind of terror. But a heavily armed, technologically superior, and completely federalized European military, operating independently of American influence, perfectly aligns with the biblical description of a force that no nation on earth can challenge. However, we must be absolutely clear on what we are not claiming in this briefing. We are not stating that the current European rapid deployment capacity is the literal army of the Antichrist, nor are we claiming that the current leadership in Brussels represents the beast of Revelation. We are interpreting the structural trend. We are observing the prophetic scaffolding being built in real time. The political and military centralization we see today may simply be the infrastructure that a future, incredibly deceptive leader will eventually hijack. The geopolitical board is being set, even if the final players have not yet taken their seats. When scanning the internet for updates on Bible prophecy, you will quickly find that the vast majority of prophecy channels are obsessively focused on conflicts in the Middle East or the aggressive maneuvers of Russia and Iran. While those regions are absolutely critical to the prophetic timeline, this intense Eastern focus causes many believers to completely ignore the massive structural changes happening in the West. Because Europe has enjoyed over 70 years of relative peace and has branded itself as a soft power diplomatic project, many Christians have simply taken their eyes off the very region where the biblical Antichrist system is prophesied to originate. What most channels completely miss is the biblical reality of how the final global dictator will actually rule. Popular Christian fiction and Hollywood movies often portray the Antichrist as a smooth-talking, charismatic politician who somehow hypnotizes the entire world into peaceful submission using charm and deception alone. But this is not what the Bible says. The book of Daniel describes the final Roman system as a beast with iron teeth that devours, breaks in pieces, and stamps the residue with its feet. Daniel chapter 11 explicitly states that the Antichrist will honor the God of forces and that he will act against the strongest fortresses. He is a brutal military dictator who enforces his will through overwhelming hard power. Therefore, a pacifist, demilitarized Europe could never produce the beast of Revelation. The beast requires teeth. It requires an advanced military-industrial complex, a centralized command structure, and the political will to use devastating force. By ignoring the European Union's sudden, shocking pivot toward continental militarization, most channels are missing the formation of the very iron teeth that Daniel prophesied. The Antichrist will not build his army from scratch. He will inherit a massive, highly integrated military machine. And the rapid construction of that specific military machine is exactly what is happening in Brussels right now. So, as we move forward, what are the concrete geopolitical signs that Christians should be watching for regarding the militarization of the European Union? We must move past vague speculation and watch for very specific policy shifts in Brussels. First, watch for the appointment of a single powerful European defense commissioner. For decades, Defense was strictly the responsibility of individual sovereign nations. But the European Commission is actively pushing to centralize this authority. If you see a single individual granted sweeping executive powers over the entire European defense industry and military procurement, you are watching the consolidation of military power into the hands of an elite few, a massive step toward the centralized dictatorship described in Revelation. Secondly, watch for the first official, independent deployment of the EU rapid deployment capacity. Pay close attention to the moment the European Union deploys its own troops into a conflict zone completely independent of NATO or the United States. The moment Europe proves it can project hard military power on its own authority, the geopolitical balance of the world will fundamentally shift, and the prophesied independence of the final Roman system will be solidified. Third, watch the defense industry mergers within Europe. The EU is currently incentivizing national defense companies to merge into massive transnational corporations to build the next generation of fighter jets, tanks, and drones. This is the industrial forging of the iron teeth. You cannot have a unified army without a unified weapons industry. Finally, and most importantly, continue to watch the aggressive political war against the national veto. As long as individual nations can say no to Brussels, the beast cannot fully act with one mind, as Revelation 17 demands. The moment the European Union abolishes the veto and moves to qualified majority voting for military action, the sovereignty of the individual nations will effectively end, and the stage for the 10-king confederacy will be fully set. Watch the laws, not just the weapons. As we process this intelligence and watch the geopolitical map rearrange itself to fit the ancient prophecies of the Bible, it is very easy to allow fear and anxiety to take root in our hearts. The thought of a massive, centralized military power rising in Europe to eventually enforce the will of a global dictator is a terrifying reality. But as Christians, we must never read the news without immediately filtering it through the absolute sovereignty of God. The book of Revelation does not hide the brutality of the coming beast system, but it also does not hide the final outcome. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 14, immediately after describing the 10 kings who give their military strength to the beast, the Apostle John writes, "These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful." This is the ultimate, unchangeable reality of human history. The European Union can spend hundreds of billions of euros on advanced weaponry. They can centralize their command structures, eliminate national vetoes, and build the most technologically advanced military force the world has ever seen. But all of that combined military might is absolutely nothing compared to the breath of the mouth of Jesus Christ. The Antichrist will gather his armies, but he will be utterly destroyed by the returning King of Kings. Therefore, our response to the rapid militarization of Europe must not be panic. Our response must be spiritual urgency. God is pulling back the curtain and showing us that the geopolitical stage is being set for the end of the age. This is the time to wake up from spiritual apathy. This is the time to ensure that your trust is placed entirely in Jesus Christ and not in the fragile political systems of this world. Let these headlines drive you deeper into the Word of God, deeper into prayer, and deeper into a life of uncompromising holiness. Keep your eyes open, stay vigilant, and remember that our redemption draws near.